Christos anesti negrum fanato.
The handout, I'm a very big believer that a handout shouldn't be more than 2 pages. And so I didn't put any of Freud on there. I would like to read some passages of Freud to you to start us off as our kind of modern thinker to juxtapose what will soon be Plato's position and the Platonist position. So the first thing I want to say, this comes from, by the way, Freud's Civilization and its Discontents, which I think is the closest to Freud being systematic in some sense. So Freud wrote all kinds of things, Tome and Taboo, the pleasure principle, etc. But I think this book, I used to teach it frequently, because at least you can kind of get, if you want like the summary of Plato within like 100 pages, here it is. So anyhow, on page 25 of Civilization's Discontents, at least in this publication, Freud has the following to say. As we see, what decides the purpose of life is simply the program of the pleasure principle. This principle dominates the operation of the mental apparatus from the start. There can be no doubt about its efficacy, and yet its program is at loggerheads with the whole world, with the macrocosm as such, as with the microcosm. There is no possibility of all of its being carried through. All the regulations of the universe run counter to it. So this is one account, a modern account of beauty. Beauty is reducible to sexual desire, and its manifestations are the mark of some kind of repression. But is there an alternative view of beauty to this? Of course, I'm going to say there is. And to do that, to set us up in this session, which will set us up for the sessions to come, the remainder of the class, I want to talk about Plato and Platonism, which I hinted towards, spoke about in our first lecture. But we might ask why? Why talk about Plato? Why talk about philosophy? Why not just jump right into the scriptures and the fathers? Many great saints, I could really list innumerable ones, St. Justin Martyr, St. Clement of Alexandria, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Augustine of Hippo, St. Dionysius, all used Plato. And not just used him, but they exhorted others to use him. And if you don't believe me, I have a quote from St. Basil the Great, which is your first quote on your handout. Basil's address to young men on Greek literature. Given Basil's importance in our tradition, I hope that these words will not go unheard. Now, this is my counsel, that you should not unqualifiedly give over your minds to these men, as a ship is surrendered to the rudder, to follow whither they list, but that, while receiving whatever value they have to offer, you yet recognize what is wise to ignore. Okay, so Basil begins by saying, hey, look, we're going to look at these things, but be careful. I'm not telling you to just suddenly devour all of Plato and agree with Plato and everything. You need to recognize what is wise to ignore. However, he continues, into the life eternal the Holy Scriptures lead us, which teach us through divine words. But so long as our immaturity forbids our understanding their deep thought, we exercise our spiritual perceptions upon profane writings, which are not altogether different. I love that. Are not altogether different from what we find in the Scriptures, and in which we perceive the truth, as it were, in shadows and in mirrors. Since we must needs attain to the life to come through virtue, our attention is to be chiefly fastened upon those many passages from the poets, from the historians, and especially from the philosophers, in which virtue itself is praised. In a word, he who would not bury himself in the mire of sensuality must deem the whole body of little worth, or must, as Plato puts it, pay only so much heed to the body as is an aid to wisdom. Or, as Paul admonishes somewhere in a similar passage, let no one make provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof. I love right there he's saying, look, Plato and Paul are saying the same thing. For the journey of this life eternal, I would advise you to husband resources, leaving no stone unturned, as the proverb has it, whence you might derive any aid. From this task we shall not shrink because it is hard and laborious, but remembering the precept that every man ought to choose the better life, and expecting that association will render it pleasant, we shall busy ourselves with those things that are best. Man, I would have loved to have been the young man being spoken to by St. Basil here. And so I want to follow St. Basil. And I want to say that because our immaturity forbids our understanding, if we are to understand the scriptures and the Holy Fathers, we ought to attend to Plato. We ought to attend to the Platonists, for they are not altogether different. And our fathers tell us to especially hear the philosophers, including Plato, and that in doing so, we will derive much aid, and it will exhort us to a better life, a life that, though hard, we ought to commit ourselves to. And so, we now turn to Plato. Here is Plato's claim in the Phaedo regarding the forms and what beauty is. He says, if there is anything beautiful besides the beautiful itself, it is beautiful for no other reason than that it shares in that beautiful. Here, in the Phaedo, the context, through the mouth of Socrates, we are inquiring into the causes of things. Why do we do the things we do? When I say, why did that happen? What kind of answer am I looking for? Socrates famously says, when I'm sitting in the chair, and you say, why are you sitting in this chair? There's different kinds of answers to that. And Socrates is clear. If you said, I am sitting in this chair because my muscles are contracted, my bones are of a certain density, and the gravity is holding me to this chair, you would have given me a wrong answer. If you thought that was the answer for why you were sitting in the chair, and not, as Socrates says, because my mind had guided me to believe that sitting in this chair is something I ought to do, that there is some higher level ordering or direction that makes those sinews and muscles and bones operate the way they do, you are just confused. You're confused about what the answer to the question why is. And so, similarly, when we speak about beauty, when we say, why is something beautiful? What makes it beautiful? Socrates says, the answer must be, it sounds like a tautology, there is no other reason why something is beautiful than that it displays beauty in some way. Now, he doesn't stop there, of course. He's going to unpack what that means, but he's giving a formal answer. Why is something beautiful? Because it displays, it participates in, it shows the form beauty. Now, I had mentioned this in our last lecture, but I want to repeat it with a little more detail. It was Plato that argued, or who had argued, that what was truly real were these immaterial forms. When I see a fox, I know it's a fox. I look at something, and the idea presented to my mind is foxness. And say there is this fox over here named Bernard, and there's another fox over here named Sophia. How do I recognize them both as foxes? Plato argued that I am perceiving the form, which makes them intelligible, gives them their defining shape and character. And since foxness, is something that can exist in different times and places. Again, there's Bernard, there's Sophia. Let's say Bernard lives in 2022 and Sophia lived in Pompeii, right? But yet they're both foxes. They can even exist as foxes simultaneously. Two foxes in 2022, Bernard and Sophia right here, right now. And there must be some reality. Again, foxness, almost capital F, which gives these particular foxes their existence in which these foxes manifest. They reflect, you might say, true foxness, the reality of the idea fox. And this can be said for anything that exists, be it other organisms or ideas like beauty. So, turning to Plato, this is quote number 3. This is from his Parmenides. I suppose that your reason for thinking each form to be one is this. Whenever it appears to you that there are some many large things, perhaps there seems to be some one character, again in Greek, idea, this is form, which is the same when you look at all of them, on the basis of which you think that largeness is one. In other words, there is one idea large, or fox, or equal, or justice. You can see that this word character, again, idea, is the same word we have in English for idea, like, hey, I have an idea over here. When I see two foxes, I nonetheless have one idea. Two foxes, one idea. Fox. They're both foxes. Fox, though, the idea of fox is one thing, one idea, one shape, one character, which is displayed in these two creatures. And as the quote suggests, I could say that the same thing is true about being large or any idea you might have about the world. When we say Tony is large or that tree is large, we know what the word large means. The same reality, largeness, is present in both, but to different degrees. The scholar Lloyd Gerson explains the heart of Plato's argument in this way, and I quote number 4. If something is large, then large stands for a real feature in the world. But if something else can be large too, that is, if large is not part of the identity of just one thing, then there must be another real part of the world that the word largeness stands for. Why? Because largeness is what these two things share in. That's an important word. Participate in. If largeness referred to the same thing to which large referred, then the two large things could not also be the same or possess the identical nature. From here, it is but a step to the conclusion that things like largeness are the entities that provide eternally the condition for the possibility of things having words like large correctly used of them. To put it simply, largeness, fox, circle, beauty, you name it, are objective realities over and above the particular things that manifest them. They are more real, more eternal, more enduring than any individual fox or circle or large thing or beautiful thing might be. The reason I can intelligibly say Bernard and Sophia are foxes, or Tony and that tree are large, or these two figures are circles, is because they all display objective ideas that I am getting into contact with when I engage with them. Now I say that to set up, of course, beauty, because beauty is one of these ideas. And for Plato, it's not just one among many, like foxes and, snails, but somehow a more transcendental, fundamental, crucial idea that rules over all the others. So look at number 5 in Plato's Symposium, a beautiful dialogue about love and desire and beauty. He summarizes, "This is what it is to go aright, or be led by another into the mystery of love. One goes always upwards for the sake of this beauty, starting out from beautiful things and using them like rising stairs, from one body to two, and from two to all the beautiful bodies, then from beautiful bodies to beautiful customs, and from customs to learning beautiful things, and from these lessons he arrives in the end at this lesson, which is learning of this very beauty, so that in the end it comes to know just what it is to be beautiful." This is the mystical ascent that my title suggests, and I have it here for you. You start, and I think, again, I taught teenagers for a long time. Teenagers start here, frankly, right? You fall in love. And you fall in love because someone's attractive. And here even Freud's not wrong, right? The very first thing is I see a body. And I'm like, that's pretty nice, right? But then as I go deeper, say you start to date somebody, you get over just the fact that they're attractive. You start to fall in love with something else. What he calls the customs, the soul, the habits, the laws that are within them. You start to see a different kind of beauty. A beauty that's not quite perceptible. Now, you can't easily point to and say, that's what I find really beautiful. Someone might, I guess, say, what is it that you see in them, right? You're like, oh no, I see something. And so you go from body to bodies. You might begin to see all kinds of things as beautiful, to beautiful customs, start to see the goods of the soul as truly beautiful, to then, again, ideas as beautiful. And not just beautiful, but more beautiful than bodies. This doesn't happen very often. This is when you become an egghead, right? You finally go, I don't even want to look at bodies. I want to talk about ideas. And I'm in love with ideas. Even as Christians, we begin to say there are things which are immaterial, ideas like love, right? Or devotion or obedience or humility, which are higher than any other goods that I might find beautiful or pleasing. And eventually, Plato suggests we will come to beauty itself, the thing that makes all of those things beautiful. This ascent to beauty itself, this contact with beauty itself, is becoming immortal. It's cultivating virtue. It's knowing God. And so in number 6, Plato continues, only then will it become possible for him to give birth, not to images of virtue, because he's in touch with no images, but to true virtue, because he is in touch with true beauty. The love of the gods belongs to anyone who has given birth to true virtue and nourished it. And if any human could become immortal, it would be he. Remember in my first lecture, we ended the fundamental desire that beauty is manifesting, and our attraction to it is our desire for immortality, our desire for God. And this is what the mystical ascent is. It is starting with something lower in the hierarchy, which nonetheless displays some character, some reflection of beauty, and moving from that particular instance to more and more and more real realities, eventually coming to the reality itself, which causes beauty in all things. And so Plato says in a different work, the Phaedrus, that we are nourished on this beauty, that the soul begins to grow wings. Of course, not literally, but it's like it grows wings in its strength, its longing, its ardor to gaze at these immaterial realities. Quote number 7. Let us turn to what causes the shedding of the wings, what makes them fall away from a soul. It is something of this sort. By their nature, wings have the power to lift up heavy things and raise them aloft where the gods all dwell. And so, more than anything that pertains to the body, they are akin to the divine, which has beauty, wisdom, goodness, and everything of that sort. These nourish the soul's wings, which grow best in their presence. But foulness and ugliness make the wings shrink and disappear. And so we have a choice, right? We can either go down the hierarchy, turn to lower things, turn to bodies, and feast on them, so to speak, or turn away from them and ascend up the hierarchy, nourish those wings by continually keeping in our minds, in our souls, the ideas of beauty, wisdom, goodness, these very difficult things to understand and to grasp, and yet they are the things that motivate us. I often, frankly, don't die for a nice-looking hedge, but I will die for my land, or my family, or my faith. It gets more and more abstract. It's very interesting. The more abstract the idea gets, the more you're willing to put down, the more that's on the line. And so quote number 8. For just this reason it is fair that only a philosopher's mind grows wings, since its memory always keeps it as close as possible to those realities by being close to which the gods are divine. A man who uses reminders of these things correctly is always at the highest, most perfect level of initiation. And he is the only one who is perfect, as perfect can be. He stands outside human concerns and draws close to the divine. Ordinary people think he is disturbed and rebuke him for this, unaware that he is possessed by God. Now this takes me to the whole point of my discussion of the fourth kind of madness, that which someone shows when he sees the beauty we have down here and is reminded of true beauty. Then he takes wings and flutters in his eagerness to rise up, but is unable to do so, and he gazes aloft like a bird, paying no attention to what is down below. And that is what brings on him the charge that he has gone mad. This is the best and noblest of all the forms that possession by God can take for anyone who has it or is connected to it. And when someone who loves beauty is touched by this madness, he is called a lover. Now, if there's a beautiful play here, right? The real philosopher, philosophia, the real lover of wisdom, is one who is aiming, even as Socrates says in the Phaedo, for death. Because the things that the real lover of wisdom desires are not things of the world. They're not things that I can go buy at the store. This is not what I want. I can see them as reflections of what I want, but I must always recognize them as reflections. You know, I'd say in the Christian tradition, idolatry is precisely seeing a reflection as more than it is. Failing to see it as a reflection of something higher, taking it as the absolute. And so when we are possessed by God, we become a lover, we become, as Plotinus says elsewhere, drunk on the nectar. We are touched by beauty. We leave aside all earthly cares, as we say in the liturgy. And quite frankly, Some people always go, Plato's Republic or whatever, how optimistic, how utopian. Sounds like a monk to me, right? Plato's ideal philosopher is in some sense the monk, the one who is continually keeping in his memory and reminding himself of things other than this world. He's outside human cares. People think he's crazy. He seems possessed by a god. He's a true lover, a lover of things beyond the world. Okay, that sets up at least the sort of apparatus, you might say, of beauty. Our contact with it, our assent to it, in terms not assent intellectually, but our assent, that mystical assent to beauty itself. But what about beauty in action? Let's think about beauty as it actually appears in the world and how it affects us and how we see it, how we come to know it. I want to come to a formal question, one I also brought up last time, which is, what is beauty? Again, like what sort of things we point to when we think of beauty? And we talked about all kinds of different things. If I recall, coherence and passion and symmetry and these kinds of things. We're now moving from Plato to Plotinus, who lived about 700 years later and was one of the great synthesizers of the Greek philosophical tradition. And so he asked, if you had the opportunity to read Ennead 1.6, he asked at the very beginning of that, is beauty bodily? Of course, we already can see it's not going to be, but that also means that the things we think often are beauty, like symmetry, proportion, something in the body, are effects of beauty, but do not define beauty. Why? Beauty is something prior. If I use a fancy philosophical word, ontologically, it has more being, more reality than the things that display it. And if we think about beauty as proportion, we would mean that beauty is fundamentally a bodily thing. It's low on the hierarchy when it should be higher. But more importantly, Plotinus has the following to say. If beauty were proportion, then the following examples of beautiful things shouldn't be possible. Think about beautiful color, beautiful light, gold, lightning, stars, the beauties that we find in the soul, the beauty of virtue, the beauty of contemplation. None of these things have proportion. I mean, particularly like in terms of color or like a bar of gold, we can just sort of look at it and go, oh, that's really beautiful. There's nothing I can sit there and measure and go, yes, the ratio is just so. It's beautiful. And so Plotinus uses these as counterexamples to say, yes, in some things, proportion and symmetry and so on manifest beauty. That's what beauty causes in those things, but that's not what it means to be beautiful. So what is beauty? It's something in bodies, but beyond bodies. And of course, we see it in the world and it excites us. And of course, we're going to see its form. It's these ideas. And on quote 9, Plotinus says, we say that these are beautiful by participation in form. For everything that is shapeless, but is by nature capable of receiving shape or form, having no share in an expressed principle or form, is ugly and stands outside divine reason. This is complete ugliness. So here, I just want to point out, form, we have the Greek here, idea, but the word expressed principle that Plotinus often uses is logos. The same logos that we find at the beginning of the Gospel of John. That is, something about beauty is participation in form, but this form is connected to the concept of logos, a rational principle of forming, a shaping principle. You might say, in a Christian idiom, to be beautiful is to participate, to know, to obey the logos, including the logos within you, the logos that is in you, your nature caused by the capital L logos. Plotinus uses ugliness, he starts there, to get us to really start thinking about beauty. He says if you can see ugliness, if you can imagine ugliness, you might begin to understand what we mean here by beauty is form and logos. So, quote 10, but something is also ugly if it has not been mastered by shape and an express principle. Again, this is the logo, or derivative of the word logos, due to the fact that its matter has not allowed itself to be shaped completely according to form, idea. The form then approaches the matter and organizes what is going to be a single composite made from many parts, and guides it into being a completed unity. It makes it one by the parts' acceptance of this. And since the form is one, that which is shaped had to be one. to the extent possible for that which is composed of many parts. So imagine even your own life. Let's take something semi-abstract. It has all kinds of parts. All kinds of things fit into your narrative, like how you got here, what you're doing, who you married, the kids you had, whatever, right? All those parts. And now, for your life to be beautiful, it has to be mastered by shape. It has to have a rational narrative to it. There's got to be some cohesion, something that organizes all those parts into a unity, makes your life intelligible to yourself. That's why you tell your stories that this is who I am. You are imposing a form and a rational principle. You are organizing those parts and giving it to someone else. And an act of self-understanding, really. You're not always sort of talking about yourself in a selfish way. You're sometimes talking about yourself, and in that very process, understanding yourself. You're organizing yourself, and therefore giving more coherence and beauty to your life. Beauty in the soul entails the same thing. Shape, organization, and unity in accordance with one's logos or rational principle. You could say nature, the idea in the mind of God. God has an idea, a form for human beings. Human beings have a certain shape. They have certain rational principles. They have certain ends. They do certain things. And if we live into that nature, we do what humans are supposed to do, we are beautiful. We participate in beauty. If we go the opposite of our nature, we reject our nature, we become hideous, monstrous, ugly. Now, I love this next passage. Here, Plotinus describes the ugly soul. He's like, you want to get a sense of beauty? Imagine the ugly soul. This is quote 11. Would you like to consider the opposites, the ugly things that come to be in the soul, and contrast them with the beauties? For perhaps a consideration of what ugliness is and why it appears as such would contribute to our achieving what we are seeking. Let there be a soul that is actually ugly, one that is licentious and unjust, filled with all manner of appetites and every type of dread, mired in fear due to its cowardice and in envy due to its pettiness, thinking that everything it can actually think of is mortal and base, deformed in every way, a lover of impure pleasures, that is, one who lives a life in which corporeal pleasures are measured by their vileness. This is indeed what I regard as an impure soul, dragged in every direction by its chains towards whatever it happens to perceive with its senses, with much of what belongs to the body adulterating it, deeply implicating itself with the material element, and taking that element into itself due to that adulteration that only makes it worse. It exchanges the form it has for another. I don't know what you imagine when you read this. It's kind of hard because, of course, it's like an extreme view. It's like a human broken and vile in every way. We can think, we brought it up last time, and think of just a brilliant sociopath serial killer, right? Vile, disgusting desires, and controlled, motivated by passions and pleasures that they have no control over, thinking that the exercise of those desires is what it means to be human, is a life worth living. This is ugliness. It's a human being completely disproportionate, completely out of whack, completely lacking unity, organization. Its parts are not operating. Its reason doesn't work properly. Its appetites don't work properly. Its thumotic element, its spirited element, that which fights or flights, doesn't work properly. Its perceptions don't work properly. Nothing in this thing works properly. It's barely human. It's a beast. And so it's hideous. The virtuous soul, however, is beautiful. You might say, what's the opposite of that picture? The picture of the soul that's in every type of dread, mired in fear, and so on. Here, you don't have this quote, but here's something Plotinus has to say about virtue, and I do have it up here. There's going to be these two kind of stages. He has more than two, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about the cathartic virtues and the paradigmatic virtues. Here is what happens when beauty comes to rest in the soul, when the soul begins to drink deeply of that beautiful. He says, since the soul is evil when it is enmeshed in the body, and has come to experience the same things as it, and has come to believe the same things, it would be good, that is, it would have virtue, if it were not to believe these things, but were to act alone, which is what thinking and being wise is. So step one, the virtue of wisdom is not consenting to the things of the world, not trusting everything your senses tell you, what the world tells you. It's instead turning inward, acting alone, acting with your rational faculties oriented towards proper things. This is what it means to be wise. He continues, and not feel the same things as the body. As the body tells you, your body tells you all kinds of stuff, right? I'm tired, I'm hungry, whatever. I want this, go buy that thing. Don't listen to the body. And when you detach from the body, when your body tells you things, you go, no, this is self-control or moderation. When you begin to dominate the body, have control over it and not it over you. And not fear being separated from the body, which is called courage. Right? So not only do I not trust the senses, I've turned inward, I care about different order of things. This is wisdom. I have begun to treat my body as it ought to be treated, as a servant to the master. This is moderation. And then courage is that I don't even fear being separated from the body. That is, I don't fear death. And then lastly, and if reason or intellect were to lead it, with the appetites not opposing it, this is what justice would be. Justice in the soul is the sort of rational faculty guiding and guarding and motivating all other parts of ourselves. And so when we begin to cultivate virtue in this sense, we purify our souls. We are aware of pleasure as needed. We're on a needs basis. And we remove or bear pain as needed. We excise passion, or we refuse to participate in the passions we can't get rid of. And therefore, we do not have any fear of our passions, and we have no vicious desires. This for Plotinus, for the Platonists, for the Greek philosophers of the same era of the early Holy Fathers, is what a perfect human begins to look like. A human with a purified reason, purified passions and body. But something Plotinus says, I love pointing this out because I think it's so important to orthodoxy, is this is a sinless human. And yet Plotinus says something very interesting. Again, you don't have this quote, but he says, there is then no moral error, hamartia, what we normally translate as sin. There's no sin in anything of this sort for a human being, but only the occasion for morally perfect acting. The focus, Plotinus says, is not on being exempt from sin or moral error, but on being God. I love this so much because we focus, especially Christianity of our culture, focuses on sin and sinlessness as if that's where the battle was. So that's what's really important. But even Plotinus points out, being sinless ain't all that great. It's okay. But look, squirrels are sinless. They're not participating in God. So you could be a sinless human being and still not be God, not participate in God. You could just be an animal doing what you're supposed to be doing. The problem with human beings is we don't even do that. Squirrels are better than us because at least they listen to their nature. We don't even listen to our nature. But it's a mistake to think recovering from sin, being sinless, is the final goal. The final goal is none other than participating in God, theosis. And so if we begin to shift, not just cathartic, purified virtues, but paradigmatic, God-like virtue, what does it look like to be, again, to quote the life of St. Anthony, a God dwelling in the flesh? He says, for intellection in the intelligible world is scientific understanding or theoretical wisdom, and being self-related is self-control. And taking care of one's own affairs is one's proper function. And courage is in a way the immaterial state of remaining pure in oneself. And so all the virtues begin to get transformed. Wisdom has no worldly pointers. Wisdom is self-concentration in the achievement of true knowledge. It's knowing oneself perfectly and being essentially perfectly transparent to truth. Moderation is being perfectly self-related to oneself. Justice is unity with oneself in one's proper functioning. Courage is remaining in a pure and immaterial state. Once again, this sounds like the saint, right? The saint is the one who has achieved these things, who has become beautiful in their acquisition of virtue, and not just virtue again as being sinless, beautiful because radiant with the glory of God, having become a friend of God in their participation with God. And that's why we find saints beautiful. It's why we're attracted. It's why we're sitting here right now, right? And even in this building, wanting to be surrounded by the saints to imitate them is just because we find their lives beautiful and we want it for ourselves. And so I'll conclude with this final quote, where Plotinus comes round to saying something like theosis again. For this reason, this is number 12 on your handout, it is correctly said that goodness and being beautiful for the soul consists in being assimilated to God, because it is in the intelligible world that beauty is found, as well as the fate of the rest of beings. Or rather, beings are what beauty is, and ugliness is the other nature, primary evil itself, so that for God, good and beautiful are identical, or rather, the good and beauty are identical. And so what is beauty? For the Platonists, it is the cosmos reflecting God. It is a theophany in the sense of the whole universe is showing these forms, these ideas, these divine expressed rational principles, whether it's foxes or circles or justice. Even further, it's the sage. Even for Plotinus, this desire to not just be sinless, but to somehow genuinely partake of the divine. For the Christian, as we'll come to see, all these ideas are in some sense adopted and transformed. As St. Basil says, we ought to attend to the philosophers, especially when they talk about virtue. And here we find a philosopher talk about virtue, and that discussion of virtue is indistinguishable from his discussion of beauty. Because, as he says, God is good and beautiful, and the saint is a God dwelling in the flesh. Thank you, and questions, comments, concerns.
The fundamental innate nature of mankind is understood and spoken of. And how did us, we in the modern age, turn to something totally different, taking as an axiom that it's not true.
Right.
Like Freud did.
Yeah, one of these things where if you do any kind of reading, you're reading magazines or journals or whatever, it's like everyone has written something about, modernity and how we got here. It's a pretty, as they say, spicy topic. So all I can do is give my own thought of what happened. I do think, here's my theory, so to speak. I think the West is a series of revolutions which slowly divorce us from these proper axioms, as you put it. The first one for the Orthodox has to be, for example, the schism with the Western Church. And I think the mistake there, and the mistake that gets played out over time, is the Church begins to be seen as an institution which is headed by the Pope of Rome, in which Catholicity is determined by union with the Pope, and in which the Pope may exercise certain sort of extra ecclesial powers, which get later codified in something like Vatican I. And I do think in some sense the filioque, these things are downstream from that more fundamental issue. Because in one sense, there's no filioque problem without a pope inserting it into the creed. Right? So in terms of the sort of mechanism in which that occurs is the papacy, and most East-West problems, even if they're not conceived that way at the time, are struggles of politics and power with the Roman primacy. I think that begins to divorce Christianity from what might be considered its liturgical, I hesitate to say mystical, but I will, sort of foundation. I could go one step further, however, one step back, I should say, before we even get to the papacy. Even with Augustine of Hippo, I'm a big defender of Augustine. I think there's a lot of people who misunderstand Augustine and want to predicate upon Augustine everything on the planet. But one thing that can be predicated of Augustine is that because he speaks Latin, reads Latin, and by his own lights in De Trinitate, says, I don't know Greek very well. In Confessions, he says, I don't know Greek very well. I don't like learning Greek. In his text on the Trinity, he explicitly says the theophanies of the Old Testament are created effects. They're not real encounters with God. So even though Augustine himself in the Confessions, Book 7, has this gorgeous ascent to beauty, being itself, and he has this gorgeous language of eros and longing and pining for the beautiful. he begins to veer in a different direction where he can't possibly conceive of how it's the case that it's the uncreated God who appears in the burning bush. So he says it's got to be an angel. It's got to be some creative effect. And that begins to tear a sort of a gap between our world and the other world. Things are no longer about theophany and divine participation. They're now two worlds where we have to consistently ask, how do these things interact with each other? So Augustine now moved forward to this great schism. I think the Reformation drives that wedge further as the West develops a very ornate judicial language. I think people talk about judicial language and don't even grasp how ornate it is. I think even Catholics don't grasp how ornate it is. Like, there was a period where the medieval imagination included not just sort of purgatory and its temporal suffering, but the indulgences and the acts of mercy and the exchanges that one could do. I mean, it's a whole system of which, by the way, the papacy controls the merits. It controls the merits of Christ and the saints and may disperse them at his will. And so the Reformation just says, hey, look, why don't we get rid of that whole complicated system of transactions and have one transaction, that one transaction on the cross, which is acquired by faith. But by this point, the Reformation begins to divorce us from liturgy, from cult, from religion as such. I don't need any of that anymore. I don't need mediation. I don't need theophany. I don't need liturgy. I don't need sacraments, right? I only need the basic necessary sacraments to get me that faith, which ultimately is just like baptism and maybe the Eucharist. And so you have another divorce. And then you continue. The Enlightenment then begins to throw a divorce between faith and reason. A divorce that we're still talking about, as if faith and reason were somehow these two, diverse territories that are in competition with one another. And so I've been divorced from the church. I've been divorced from religion, in terms of liturgy, sort of worship. I'm now divorced from rationality and faith. And now I keep going. The French Revolution divorces you from nation. You're uprooted. You're nowhere. You belong to nothing. You're a free individual. The Industrial Revolution, you're now derooted from your labor, right? You're just a consumer. And this is where Marx is right, quite frankly. I mean, Marx's critiques of capitalism are legitimate. The solutions are wrong. But he deeply understands that capitalism alienates you from labor and from your community, and that all you become is a transaction of labor. And then keep on going to the present. The sexual revolution. I'm now denatured from my family, from the proper use of my body. And now what we see today, the internet revolution, I'm divorced from nature herself, right? And so I think there's this long pipeline where everything that would mediate God to you at some point, right? The church, her worship, the deep relationship between faith and reason, your nation, right? Your labor, your family, your body, nature, you have no connections to those. You are a free, floating atom with just base desires, as Freud says. So that's a long answer to your question, but how do we get here? I think there's a lot of baby steps taken way back when, and that's how these things work themselves out. And so I think, not to wax apocalyptic or something, but say we are kind of at the end of a long series of revolutions where the only thing human beings haven't conquered is nature. But we're trying, And so how can we rethread all of that and say we need all of that to mediate God to us? Or we're going to be in a situation like we're in now. Yeah, it's good. And we'll talk about, to your point, the next session, sort of provocatively borrowing from Father Silviu Bunta, called Bodies Brought to Rot. There is, Platonism is not the last word. Even St. Basil would say, hey, go read Plato and be done. There are problems in Platonism, and there are some failures, and there's something that Christianity does that Platonism couldn't fathom. And that is saying that, the beautiful one, took on flesh, took on dust, died, and so on. And this is very scandalous to Platonists and many other Greek philosophers. So we'll start talking about how Christianity begins to, though not completely alien to the Platonic tradition, begins to put a certain emphasis on the body and the world and its goodness and its capacity to reflect the divine and its eschatological end that is quite radical in the ancient world. No spoiler alerts. Come next week. Yes.
How is it that unlearned men and women are able to progress to being saints without not ever necessarily understanding these philosophical concepts? Is that kind of not buried, but just sewn into the tradition of the church, or is that an encounter with the beauty of God?
Yeah, great question. So you pointed out, I think, a real problem, which is, sort of following that trajectory of revolutions. I mean, even Plato himself, for example, was a deep pessimist about education. I mean, he just thought, look, not everyone's going to wake up tomorrow and become baby philosophers. This is not going to happen. And it's really a very progressivist idea that something like education will save the world. We'll get more progress, we'll get people more educated, and things will just get better and better and better. And this is just, naive at best. I think that we are lucky to live in a country that basically does have, so to speak, such high access to education, and yet, from my own perspective, I'd say we actually, despite we have formally the most educated population, we have in many ways, I think, the most unthinking population. We don't actually have sort of skills of the learned or something like this. We have access to information, but even Plato would say access to information is a disaster, right? And even for Plato, like, pure democracy is a disaster, because to presume pure democracy is good is presume human desires are good most of the time. So to your question, how do we become saints? I definitely would not say it's by everyone suddenly getting a degree in philosophy. God forbid it, frankly. That would be a rough world. I think we are lucky to have some access to it, and it can be helpful, but per the point about the revolutions, we actually need that mediation. We need to recover that mediation. And so I would say it's through the church, through her services, her liturgy, through the readings of the saints. It's all the things that we know as Orthodox: keeping your prayer rule, going to confession, having a spiritual father, and just doing the struggle and letting the tradition sort of form you. And ultimately, there's truth in the fact that you will know it, not necessarily without having the sort of what even Plotinus would call the sort of discursive, rational articulation of it. You'll just live it. The tradition will form people in such a way that these things will be true. And so, in that sense, articulating it explicitly, rationally, in a systematic way or whatever, is helpful. It's good. There are people to do it and ought to do it, but not everyone should do it. We need to recover a world precisely like the one you were perhaps suggesting, where you walk into church and you can trust that God is going to be mediated to you through all the sort of non-rational, not anti-rational, but non-rational things in your life, by loving your family, by being a good spouse, by going to church, by taking care of your body, by living a life of prayer, reading old books, and doing these sorts of things which are typical of a good human life. I think that makes saints. Or you can also just try going out to the wilderness. I hear it works sometimes. So there's the proof, I think, for sure that philosophy is not going to do it, because people wander out to the desert and they just come out glowing, and it's like they didn't take a library with them. So other questions? Yes.
So I don't know why, but at a certain point, this idea of beauty as theophany, it reminded me of Genesis, when the serpent calls Eve to, contemplate for good and evil. How would you integrate that into theophany?
Yeah. It's funny. Someone brought this up first session, so I'll just repeat maybe, and hopefully this is the right answer. Gregory of Nyssa, in his On the Making of Man, kind of brings this up, that obviously the contemplation of the tree and the fruit and immortality, or even origin brings this up too, is a good. It is in some sense. There's a possibility of theophany there, but there are sort of strictures on engaging it. It'd be like the great paradox, like only humility is going to get you theophany, and not just because. It's not just because God says. It's like only because if you open yourself up to God in terms of lowering yourself and making yourself the proper sort of vessel, can God come and dwell. And I do think there's a lot of great saints and sort of the Ascent tradition. It's like God is trying to get to you. You're the one who's shut down and who's but wants to do things certain ways, and therefore won't allow theophany to occur. It's your attention which has gone elsewhere, not God's. And so I would say in paradise, with the tree, the garden, it's the invitation to theophany. It's the invitation to partake of the glory, to partake of the immortality. And the whole point is, as we often say at Lent, like Adam and Eve were asked to fast, and they didn't. They were asked to be obedient, and they weren't. They were asked to have humility, and they chose pride, right? And that's to essentially deny theophany. It's to say, I want something else. Because all those things are not arbitrary moral laws that God says, do this, do that, run in a circle, touch the wall, get you some theophany. It's that you have to be like me if like attracts like. And so if you want to have my life, you must live like I live. You must have the life that I have. And so here's what it looks like to have my life. And Adam and Eve said, nah, thanks. We'll try a different way. So I do think in that sense, as we'll talk about next week, of course, like Christ is theophany, and the church is theophany, and the restoration of paradise, and basically the restoration of you can get back to paradise. And even as we see in Plotinus, and even like St. Irenaeus comments on this, like even paradise was not the end, was the invitation to something else. So just like being sinless isn't the end, it's the beginning of something else. And so you might say we have the invitation to cultivate sort of sinlessness, get back to that original state, and then the real invitation is now become immortal. Right now, partake of my life and my glory. I'm going to share it with you. Our reading for tomorrow, right, says this very thing. Like, when I come and I sit on the throne of glory, if you follow me, if you proclaim me to the world, if you basically live contra mundum, you will sit with me. You will sit at the throne of glory, which is precisely what they saw on Sinai and elsewhere. So, I'd say it's definitely theophany.